Community Bicycle Shop, both programs at the Center for Latino Progress. This event is organized by a planning committee that has been meeting for almost a year. While getting into the planning group, we had to decide how to respond to the disruption of a global pandemic, and we chose to take the summit virtual with a shifted full-day schedule. Like prior years, the dinner and evening sessions connect with those that may not be able to take time off from work for a 9-to-5 summit. We have something for everyone in this year's summit breakout sessions. At the end of this keynote, you'll find the links to the next session that starts at 1:30 p.m. in the chat, or you can go to the link from the email that was sent to all that registered. So because I'm a data nerd, see if I can share my screen here. Because I'm a data nerd, there we go. I mapped out the zip codes of those registered for today's summit. You'll notice that our attendees largely hail from high quality transit and rail corridors. The attendee gap between New Haven and Providence and the gap between Springfield and Boston are quite interesting. Do those gaps look like post-pandemic regional infrastructure opportunities to you? Disruption has been a big part of 2020 and will be into 2021. That gives us an opportunity to reconsider the status quo and make important world-saving and equitable changes to our region's transportation systems, land use, and housing policies. You already know that over 1/3 of our region's greenhouse gas emissions are from the transportation sector. Facing this climate emergency while building back better from the COVID-19 disruption is a challenge that we must not shirk. Now that's enough for me, and I'll introduce our next featured speaker. Chris Murphy is the junior United States Senator from Connecticut. He recently bought a home in Hartford, just a short walk from his offices within the Coltsville National Park. Chris has dedicated his career to public service as an advocate for Connecticut families. Senator Murphy fights for job creation, affordable health care, education, sensible gun laws, and a forward-looking foreign policy. As a member of the Appropriations Committee, he has fought to increase investments in Connecticut manufacturing. Let's hear from the Senator himself about federal and state priorities for multimodal infrastructure investments and jobs access.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Murphy, U.S. Senator from Connecticut. Thanks to Transport Hartford for hosting this really important summit on making sure that we have a multimodal transportation system that allows for people to get to work through a variety of means, whether they want to walk, bike, take a bus, get on a train, or get in a car. We're way behind the curve, frankly, in this country in investing in multimodal transportation. I live in downtown Hartford, just south of downtown Hartford in the Sheldon Charter Oak neighborhood. And I know, as a fairly recent homeowner in that neighborhood, that it's not as easy as it should be if you want to walk or bike to the big workplaces in and around Hartford. And so the federal government's got to help. I'm a member of the Appropriations Committee, and I'm going to be fighting for more money from Washington going to states and municipalities to help build pedestrian pathways and bike lanes, to invest in mass transit. But we also have to recognize that if we don't actually come up with the money to pay for all of this, then it's just a bunch of plans on paper. It doesn't actually get put into action. That's why I've been supportive of initiatives at the state level to put tolls on our roads. That's why I introduced bipartisan legislation in Washington to increase the gas tax. None of those things are really popular, but if you want to actually create multimodal transportation, if you want to make it easier for people to get to work, then you have to come up with the money to do it. And I look forward to hearing about some of the ideas that you come up with, both for how we spend money, but also how we raise money to make sure that we make these investments.
All right, I'm back. This is Anthony Shirolis, and I will now introduce our next three featured speakers. Nick Cifuentes is the Executive Director of the Tri-State Transportation Campaign. He has been behind Tri-State's victories on congestion pricing, the MTA's 5-borough bus network redesign, and electrification of the full MTA bus fleet. Nick and Tri-State championed New Jersey Transit Board reform legislation and legislation to ensure that New Jersey Transit converts to electric buses. He has been appointed to the New York State Transportation Advisory Panel of the Climate Action Council. Nick is on New Jersey's Post-COVID Restart and Recovery Advisory Council, New York City's Post-COVID Surface Transportation Advisory Council, New York Penn Station Redevelopment Community Advisory Council, and there's more. Nick is part of New York City's Better Buses Action Group. He was recognized in the 2019 Albany 40 Under 40 and the 2020 Latino Power 100. And then we'll have Lynn Stoddard and her team. Lynn Stoddard and her team run Sustainable CT, a certification program that provides a roadmap and resources to help communities become more inclusive, healthy, resilient, and vibrant. Celebrating 3 years this month, 2/3 of Connecticut's municipalities and now participate in Sustainable CT, and over 1/3 have earned certification. The program's community match fund has sparked investment of over $1 million into 90+ community-led sustainability projects across Connecticut. This year's Multimodal and Transit Summit is one of those projects. Lynn coordinates Eastern Connecticut State University's climate and sustainability initiatives, and as an active volunteer in her community, chairs Mansfield's Sustainability Committee. She is an enthusiastic gardener, composter, and frequent bike commuter, and strives to live her values and create positive models for change. And after Lynn, Garrett Eucalito. Garrett joined the Connecticut Department of Transportation as a deputy commissioner in January 2020 with 15 years of experience in transportation and infrastructure, particularly in the areas of funding and finance, safety, public transportation, emerging technologies, and transportation electrification. Garrett comes to CTDOT after holding various positions, most recently as Transportation Program Director at the National Governors Association. Prior to that, he was Undersecretary for Comprehensive Planning and Intergovernmental Policy at Connecticut's Office of Policy and Management. During his time in Connecticut, Garrett served as chair of the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations and helped lead the Transit-Oriented Development Working Group. Garrett was and continues to be a member of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. Garrett spent 6 years in DC on the staff of former Senator Joe Lieberman as his legislative assistant covering appropriations, transportation, and infrastructure. In that role, he advocated for Connecticut's transportation needs, led efforts to protect the Long Island Sound and improve the state's air quality and environmental assets. And now, take it away, Nick.
Thank you, Tony. Good morning. My name is Nick Cifuentes. I'm the Executive Director of Tri-State Transportation Campaign, a 27-year-old advocacy and policy organization fighting for sustainable mobility in Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. I want to start by thanking the Center for Latino Progress for organizing this event today to discuss the future of transportation, the environment, and the impact of COVID-19. Now, the pandemic has put unprecedented strain on the region's transit agencies, and with another lockdown already underway, it's really unclear when exactly ridership will rebound. Some estimates suggest it might take years for the region to recover, which means we will need to explore and implement innovative solutions for transit funding because the traditional model has really all but imploded. The need to fund transit and clean energy has never been more urgent. And as the MTA and peer agencies prepare to dramatically cut service due to a lack of federal support during our ongoing national emergency, it's become one of our top priorities. Meanwhile, transportation is still the largest challenge in meeting our region's climate goals, with more than 38% of greenhouse gas emissions in Connecticut coming from the transportation sector. Tailpipe pollution is a prime contributor to unhealthy levels of smog and soot in our air, which is a disproportionate impact on low-income communities and communities of color. And the science is clear that breathing in emissions can cause severe illnesses and premature death. A recent study by Science Advances examined 3,000 US counties and found that even a slight spike in fine particulate matter in the air could be associated with an 11% increase in a county's COVID-19 death toll. Researchers discovered that prolonged exposure to air pollution contributes to lung and heart diseases, neurological disorders, and premature deaths, all of which could exacerbate the severity of COVID-19 symptoms and its prognosis. We have known for far too long that when it comes to climate change, our clock is running out. But 2020 has made abundantly clear not only the imminent crisis we face, but the one we are living through right now. After record-setting wildfires in the West and a hurricane season in which we ran out of names, climate change is no longer a problem that's still years away. It's here, it's now, and it's wreaking havoc every single day. And as dire as 2020 has been for every American, for millions of people in communities across the US, this year was merely an exacerbation of the pollution, disruption, and illness that they've been dealing with for years as a result of our inability to solve our climate crisis. These folks, predominantly people of color and low income, have borne the brunt of the crisis for too long, and any solutions must prioritize the acute crisis they face every single day. So, how do we address the dire state our country and world are in? The two primary ways to solve this crisis are by taking cars off the road, which can be done by expanding efficient public transit options across the region and transitioning to a carbon-free economy. Ramping down pollution during and long after COVID will be critically important for making airborne diseases less deadly, as we now know that polluting air and increased harm from COVID are inextricably linked. Bolstering public transit service and transitioning to zero emissions, all-electric bus fleets over the next 2 decades is a step in the right direction, but this does not go far enough to mitigate the worst effects of air pollution and climate change. States must work aggressively toward the goal of electrifying the transportation network, including public transit, municipal fleets, for-hire vehicles, garbage trucks, delivery vehicles, and freight and passenger trains. We'll need local, state, and federal solutions, from the Transportation and Climate Initiative to vehicle miles travel fees, to climate equity laws, to pushing the Biden administration to embrace a completely carbon-free economy, not in 10 years, not tomorrow, but on day one. Unfortunately, the world is responding to the climate crisis with increasing urgency. While a year like this one might convince some that it is too late to roll back the rising seas, snuff out the flames, scrub the soot from our skies, time and time again, humanity has faced catastrophe and stepped back from the brink. We have to believe in our unique capacity to do so again. The solutions will come from rooms and Zooms like these, from you, from us, and thousands of people like us in every country working individually and together to solve a problem more profound than any we have ever known. Thank you for being here, for being in this fight, for bringing your time and your resources and your passion to this moment, despite everything this year has thrown at us all. Thank you. It's now my great pleasure to turn the virtual mic over to Connecticut DOT Deputy Commissioner Garrett Eucalito.
Thanks, Nick. I think, Lynn, you're going to go next, and then I'll introduce our moderator, right?
Gotcha. Great. Thanks, Garrett. Good morning, everyone. Lynn Stoddard, Executive Director of Sustainable CT. Thank you all for being here this morning, and thanks so much to Transport Hartford and Tony and the team for organizing this gathering. Sustainable CT shares the goals of this summit and so many of you that are working on transportation and mobility options for everyone in our region. We believe in moving the conversation beyond transportation and land use planners, engineers, and designers, and tapping deeply into our communities, our residents, our local businesses, and creating solutions together. We aim to use these community conversations to increase mobility choices so we can all move from place to place in ways that are welcoming to all, healthy for all, safe for all, and climate friendly. Sustainable CT is a free program to help communities become more inclusive, resilient, and thriving, and to become great places to live for everyone. We're really proud to partner with many of the groups represented today to help our towns in conducting walk audits, transforming roads to become safe places for walkers and bikers of all ages and abilities, and investing in cleaner and carbon-free transit. At Sustainable CT, we certify communities that document progress and success in clean and diverse transportation systems, in addition to many other sustainability actions, including equity and inclusion, thriving local economies, vibrant arts and culture, affordable housing, clean and efficient energy, and much more. We're proud to support today's Multimodal Summit through our Community Match Fund, which has sparked over $1 million of investment in community-led sustainability projects across the state of Connecticut. Thank you for joining us today to learn and share ideas on this important topic that shapes how we all live every day. All right, now I'll hand it back to you, Garrett. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thank you, Lynn. It's a pleasure to be here today on behalf of the Connecticut Department of Transportation. I serve as the Deputy Commissioner at the DOT, where I'm lucky to work alongside 3,200 public servants working every day to keep our state moving and the system users safe. I first want to thank Transport Hartford for hosting this summit and for providing me the opportunity to participate. I know this has been a difficult year for all of us, from COVID to the fight for racial justice. Inequities in our communities are finally getting the attention that they unfortunately deserve. And to solve these inequities, transportation is at the center. From connecting individuals to a greater number of job opportunities, to providing access to fresh foods, to allowing more convenient medical appointments that don't leave our grandparents and aunts and uncles stranded, transportation can be a linchpin. Transportation can also help get individuals to our state's amazing natural parks and forests, allow for recreational opportunities on our roads, sidewalks, and trails, and provide an easy way to support your local small businesses, which need the help now more than ever. So I don't want to belabor the points raised by others. I know you all are eagerly looking forward to hearing from our keynote speakers. So I'll just leave you with this. Too often, transportation is a barrier to accessing the economy, especially in Connecticut, not only in our urban centers, but also in rural and suburban communities. And I think this has to change. Continuing to make our state a more equitable place to live, to learn, and to flourish requires all of us working together. It requires us to think outside of our modal boxes and our agency constraints. We can't address transportation inequities and the climate crisis just through our transportation projects and programs. We also need our sister state agencies, our federal partners, and our local partners to help us address land use decisions and the mix of vehicles on our roads. So thank you for being here today, and thank you for not being beaten down by this crazy year, and instead using 2020 to get even more motivated and to push for change. So with that, I want to introduce our keynote moderator. Dr. Destiny Thomas is the founder and CEO of Thrivance Group and was recently featured on Good Morning America for her leadership in the urban planning sector. At Thrivance Group, Dr. Thomas works to bring transformative justice into public policy, urban planning, and community development. With over 15 years of experience shaping key policy initiatives, Dr. Thomas believes race, place, and joy define individual and community outcomes. And with that, Dr. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Garrett, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today for this important summit. I have the very distinct pleasure and honor of hosting Dr. Adonia Lugo and Angie Schmidt on today's keynote panel. And we're going to take a bit of a different approach to keynotes today. In the spirit of those who have been fighting and working for social justice, racial justice, and certainly mobility justice since long before 2020, and in honor of those whom we lost this year because of our collective negligence and failure to meet the needs of racialized people, of people with disabilities, both visible and invisible, and our trans brothers and sisters in the built environment. I would like to dedicate this space to making sure we are not only speaking truth to the work that needs to be done, but galvanizing and motivating our colleagues to take immediate action, as those who've come before me on today's introduction have stated. Today, we're going to hear about how different people come to the mobility justice space through different journeys. We do this practice at the Thrivance group called Origin Storytelling. And so we've structured this keynote panel to do just that. So in a moment, we're going to hear from my colleagues, Adonia and Angie, about their origin stories. And they're going to take a different path to sharing who they are and to talking about some of the work that they're doing and what they're passionate about. I want you to pay close attention to the themes that come up today as we speak. We'll be confronting racism. We'll be problematizing the academy. We'll be honoring and maybe even complaining about or taking joy in what it means to be a mother. I will shed light on womanist practices in the built environment, and we will talk about my colleagues' contributions to the literary world and their efforts to really highlight and elevate the importance of equitable mobility planning and concepts. All of us have had our own moments of transformation in this work. Adonia is working to figure out ways to hold space for others and to show others how to hold space for even more people in this field. And Angie is doing the work of evolving the field of planning through disciplinary evolution and also through her connection to and allyship with the mobility justice movement. So instead of reading bios, I'm going to invite my colleagues to introduce themselves with their own origin stories. Adonia, I'd ask you to go first.
All right, thank you, Dr. Thomas. Nice to be here this morning as part of the summit, joining from Los Angeles, Tongva Territory. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and use some snapshots from the past, well, actually, I go back to pretty early in my life. So using snapshots to talk through that journey that Dr. Thomas was discussing. So of course, first you're going to have to hear me narrate, getting my presentation up into the right mode and setting myself up for screen share. Okay. So I believe we should be seeing some full screen now.
We can see you. We can see it.
Excellent, excellent. So this is a collage I put together to try and highlight some of the things I was thinking about in terms of the connections and the contradictions that I saw early on as a kid. So I was born and raised in a town called San Juan Capistrano, which is in South Orange County. It's located about halfway between San Diego and Los Angeles. And it's a town that was established on the site of an Ahashiman village as a Spanish colonial mission in 1776. And so I grew up as a mixed kid. My mom is a white descendant of European settlers to Southern California. My dad is an immigrant from the Mexican state of Nayarit. That's me in the center here on a trip to Baja California, enjoying the company of a stray dog that my sister and I met. And so I grew up in this place that had this deep colonial history of harm that was often obscured by this kind of romanticized idea of what California is and the idea of the California missions. And in my family, we happen to talk a lot about race and about the hypocrisy and unkindness of racism that we could see in our town. So the apartment where I grew up is on this map here. It's a little red dot, and you can kind of see in terms of the urban form here, or suburban, or even exurban form. The neighborhood where I lived was stretched along this very straight line. That's railroad tracks. So we were literally on the wrong side of the tracks in the townscape. It was a neighborhood where a lot of Mexican immigrant families lived. And by the time I went away to college, I think my mom was the only white person that, you know, I regularly saw in our neighborhood. And on the other side of the tracks, there was a lot more diversity, a lot more white people, but there was this profound sense of segregation that the people who lived in my neighborhood, which was called the villas, weren't welcome in the rest of the town. In some ways, I look back on that and see just how strange it was, because this was a really pretty little place where I grew up. We actually had horse stables on the other side and some undeveloped hillsides. So the neighborhood where I grew up really would not be classified, I don't think, as an urban ghetto, but that's how it was described in our townscape, because the images I have in the lower left over here get into the strong sense of white supremacist identity that was part of, and unfortunately still is to a certain degree, part of Orange County. And so, you know, in the 90s, we witnessed the fight around Proposition 187, which had to do with making sure that illegal immigrants couldn't access public services. So there was this strong sense, not necessarily in my town, but in the region, that immigrants weren't welcome. At the same time, thinking back to the Ahashiman people who have been inhabiting the region for at least 10,000 years, all of us are immigrants. It's just a matter of when we showed up. So, so a lot of contradictions. Beauty, the romance of, you know, history in California, but also this divide that my family straddled, because we were half and half. We didn't fit cleanly on one side or the other. And so I grew up feeling really mad about segregation, and mad about why, you know, Mexican families were treated like we didn't belong there, and mad about how the fact that I'm a native English speaker made it easier for me to navigate the public school system and get to go to a four-year college on scholarship. So then, strangely enough, because I'd always imagined that I was gonna like go to college and immediately jump into a lot of political activism, I actually kind of went in another direction and spent a few years while I was doing my undergraduate degree in Portland, Oregon, getting really like crafty and artsy and into an understanding of, you know, who I was as a sort of creative and do-it-yourself person. And I started being a bike commuter because that was something that was common in Portland, and it just kind of fit in with the lifestyle I was leading. I didn't think much about racial identity. I was aware of the whiteness of Portland. I'd gone through a pretty big culture shock when I first moved there in 2001. But by 2007, when I decided to come back to Southern California to start a PhD in anthropology, you know, I wasn't thinking too much about race. Well, when I came back to Southern California, thinking I was going to be able to ride my bicycle, you know, with my cute little homemade outfits and all that kind of stuff, I remembered, oh yeah, there's this thing about race and privilege and mobility, and all of these impressions I had from childhood in terms of, you know, who was supposed to be traveling easily and who wasn't, and what kinds of barriers are put in place for communities of color to get around our region. It just came back to me, and I felt this anger from motorists when I was riding my bicycle. And I started looking into it and kind of going, what's going on here? And started learning about the death that is, you know, a part of our traffic system, and the fact that that death falls more heavily on the shoulders of communities of color. And at the same time, this was 2007, 2008, I started to have my first awakening around ecological crisis, and could see, oh my gosh, this dependency we have on cars is killing us, right? Not just in terms of the the literal violence, but also in terms of carbon emissions. And here I was back home in this, you know, region known for its great weather. Why were people honking at me when I rode a bike? How come so many of the people I saw biking were, you know, people who it seemed like didn't have a lot of other choices? Or, you know, they could only afford to ride a really junky kind of bike that they couldn't keep in good condition because that's all they had access to. So I learned about this group called the Bus Riders Union, and I've got a picture of a flyer of theirs from 2008 on here that formed, I later learned, formed in the 1990s to work on the issue of transit racism within our metro system. And they have this whole history of talking about race and public transportation. And I was just kind of like, wow, how do we apply this to other kinds of sustainable transportation like bicycles? And so I ended up, you know, starting to think about that so much that I was bringing it into my grad school classes, and my professors encouraged me to be, you know, actually shifting my dissertation project to focus on that. And the contrast I was seeing, you know, again, because I just have grew up being kind of taught to look for those contradictions. When I started looking into bicycle media and stuff about being car free, the images that I saw were really white. It was like the future of sustainable transportation was for people with choices, for people who needed to go work in an office, for people who had, access to specialized kinds of equipment. It wasn't for the people that I was seeing, the black and brown men who were getting around on bicycles in Los Angeles. So by the end of 2008, I started to be part of a conversation with some other folks of color around, what was going on in Los Angeles. How could we make a connection between the day laborers or jornaleros who used bikes and other Spanish-speaking bicycle users, and the activity of bicycle advocacy, which I learned about as a field in 2008. So I'm going to attempt playing a little bit of a video that I helped create in 2009 to explain some of our early activism as the City of Lights or Ciudad de Luces project. And I think I forgot to click the share sound button. No, it looks like I'm good. Okay, try that again.
This summer, City of Lights people started to hear from bicyclists at the Carecen Day Laborer Center that they were getting ticketed for riding on the sidewalk around MacArthur Park. Since it's legal to ride on the sidewalk in Los Angeles, we decided to go take a look around the park and see if we could find any signage that stated this. This sign says no bicycles, but if you look closer, it says on Lake Perimeter Walk. It's not clear what that means, and since the sign isn't in Spanish as well, it would be easy to miss it. Then we found this sign in Spanish, but all it had printed was the standard ordinance about it being illegal to ride on the sidewalk if you're menacing pedestrians. What about the metro station?
So what happens if you ride the bike here on the sidewalk towards this side, which is technically legal for you to ride your bicycle here, but it's illegal on these grounds. So there's a very thin line.
So is it legal to ride your bike around MacArthur Park? After some discussion, we decided the best way to address the concerns of cyclists at Carecen would be to hold a legal rights workshop where we could give them information about their basic rights as bicyclists and let them know how to deal with tickets if they get them.
Okay, ahora vamos a hablar sobre los tickets.
Can you turn the sound up a little?
I'm going to go ahead and pause it there. That's enough of seeing the baby activists. So what we found in doing that work around legal rights and making sure people had access to information was that there were a lot of people who were being ticketed for things that were not technically illegal or were left up to police officers' discretion. And this was pretty alarming because, again, the conversation in the bicycle advocacy world was focusing more on infrastructure and how do you change street design and how do you get elected officials to invest in different street design. There wasn't conversation about issues like police enforcement. So over the next couple of years, up to about 2011, I continued to work on City of Lights and also another project called Ciclavia, which established an open streets event in Los Angeles. And since I was doing an anthropology PhD, I just got to do all of this analysis and grappling with, what are the boundaries between social change and the kind of stuff that we can make different just by living differently and acting differently, and what are the kind of like more material limits, and who decides where those limits are and where we're going to be making investment, who decides what the theory of change is for something like sustainable transportation. So these are just some images of the kind of wandering around and thinking and activism that I got to participate in those years, including my super fresh Shero tattoo that I got on my leg in 2010. It does not look that clear anymore, let me tell you. So by 2013, I had joined a more national conversation. I finished my PhD. I had gotten to start learning from people who were thinking about these issues in terms of bicycling, sustainable transportation, racial justice, all over the country. And I took a job working for the League of American Bicyclists in Washington, D.C., running an equity initiative. And a couple of the people pictured here were members of the Equity Advisory Council that supported that job. We got Anthony Taylor in the lower left, who's been a really important mentor to me, Keith Holt up in the center, another important mentor. And what I started learning was my understanding of the issues we were dealing with in terms of changing streets, what are the kind of barriers different people are facing, was really informed by my background as a Chicana woman, a Latinx woman, a mixed race woman, and that there were actually these really robust networks already in place around the country around Black cycling experiences as well. There was Red Bike and Green, which got established in Oakland in 2008 and had spread to some different cities under different Black women's leadership. There were all these clubs that were started in memoriam to Major Taylor, who's featured in the center here, who was just like absolutely the best bicyclist in the world in the 1890s and was a Black man who encountered all kinds of racism in his sport. And so I got to start participating in these networks and looking for ways to apply the findings to the field of bicycle advocacy. So I helped organize a conference called Future Bike in 2014. I also got to learn about the work of Biking Public Project in New York City, which does advocacy with delivery workers who use bicycles. So I got to spend a few years from 2013 to 2015 really learning about these great networks that were out there to be advancing what at the time we were calling bike equity, and trying to really change the rules of the game and change the theory of change to support the kind of issues and solutions that we saw in the communities we were part of. But we were kind of ahead of our time in the field in some ways. And, you know, by the end of 2014, when Vision Zero started to become a big national policy trend and was taking hold in different cities, there was that same issue of police enforcement being brought up by some folks as a solution for street safety and being recognized by other folks as actually not a solution. And so the last project that I did when I was working at the League of American Bicyclists was called Seeing and Believing. And what we did was gathered some testimonials from people in our network around the country, just, you know, about the relationship between street safety and race and police. And it really solidified to me that, you know, the work that was emerging at that time from the Black Lives Matter movement and the incredible focus that, you know, fortunately has been growing and growing and growing since 2013 around Trayvon Martin's murderer being acquitted, that needed to come into the field of sustainable transportation. We couldn't be talking over here about street safety while they're talking over there about public safety, and we're saying, you know, police departments are our partner, and they're saying police departments need to be dismantled and we need to redirect that funding to community empowerment. So I kind of burned out on working in the field of bicycle advocacy, and decided to return home to Los Angeles, where, you know, I had this kind of you know how you always have rose-colored glasses about places where you've been in the past. And I don't think I'm going to share this video. It's beautiful, but this is a music video from a group called Las Cafeteras that features a former colleague of mine, Marianne Aguirre, as a single mom who is also active in bicycle culture in her neighborhood in Boyle Heights. So came back to LA. Oh. Looks like YouTube has other ideas. Got to get out of full screen to go to my next slide. So came back to LA in 2015, was welcomed back into the City of Lights project, which at that time was called Multicultural Communities for Mobility. And within a couple of years, we changed our name again to People for Mobility Justice. Got to rejoin a local network of multiracial folks who were examining, you know, how sustainable transportation fits into community economies and the kinds of change we want to see. And by 2016 was part of this project called the Untokening, where enough of us who had been part of that bike equity conversation didn't necessarily want to continue on that track with bicycles specifically, but we knew we had some perspective in common that could be useful. And so we started using the term mobility justice to describe looking at street safety through this broader lens. And we had our first convening in Atlanta in 2016. That's what this photo is from. And by 2017, we'd put together this document called the Untokening 1.0 Principles of Mobility Justice. And it's a kind of free form set of statements that gets into the complexity of what is going on in our streets and how it ties in with so many other systems, and how it's not enough to just talk about the infrastructure and street design as a project on its own. So being back in LA for a couple of years, I started to be confronted by how, even though I'm someone who grew up in a colonial town, I can tell you about the Ahashiman people, whose homeland I grew up in. I wasn't really incorporating that into my my work in my adult life. And so with the help of, one Ahashiman advocate in particular, Angela Mooney DRC, I started to kind of reflect on that and try to take steps to move away from participating in Indigenous erasure. And so this image on the left here is of Modesta Avila, who was a woman born so close to where I was born in San Juan Capistrano in the 19th century, who in 1889 was imprisoned because she had attempted to be a participant in the planning of how rail was going to go through her town. She put up, a clothesline. She made some kind of symbolic gesture about not wanting to have the railroad tracks going right through her family's yard. And she went to jail, and she died in jail, sadly, just a couple years after that. Modesta was a mestiza woman with both a Ahashiman heritage and Spanish heritage. And I think of her now as a really important defining figure in terms of this colonial relationship that we still have to the land that we're operating in, and how mobility fits in, and whose stories and whose preferences have been part of creating the mobility systems we're dealing with today, and whose haven't. So in the last couple of years, I've been able to participate in creating a land acknowledgement statement for the university where I teach, Antioch University, Los Angeles. I also have partnered with the group that Angela runs, the Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples, to do a number of activities with our students, and continuing to do a review of how to indigenize the curriculum in the Urban Sustainability Master's program I run. So the last couple of years for me have been more learning and really trying to, as I occupy a niche within this field and get to have lots of opportunities like this to be speaking with audiences and stuff like that, learning how to try and use that positionality in a way that's not so much about advancing my voice, because as an anthropologist, I've always been more interested in participating in a collective process and supporting the emergence of collective voice. But how do I create space for other kinds of actions that are happening? So this year, since the tragic murder of George Floyd and the acceleration and growth of movements for racial justice, I feel like I've had a lot of opportunities to uplift what other people are working on, and where we are today in terms of having this amazing focus on Black-owned businesses here in LA, and things like this effort that I highlight here to save the Crenshaw Mall is a project to actually buy a mall space over in a really culturally important part of South Los Angeles, Crenshaw, Lamert Park, and have community-owned businesses there instead of big national ones. At the same time, we have the Kumeyaay people, whose ancestral territory spans the US-Mexico border, organizing around keeping connections across that artificial border and pushing back against the notion that they live on one side or the other. And so they've been part of this land back movement that has been gaining momentum. So in the midst of so many different kinds of movements that are going on, I try to look to the strategy framework for just transition to understand the kind of systemic change that I want to be part of, that I want, my future child to be part of, that I want my students to be part of. It has to do with seeing where we fit into today's extractive economy and doing what we can to shift into a living economy. So I'm still learning about how to actually, grapple with those contradictions that have been in my face since I was just a little brown kid in Southern California. And I feel hopeful that there is so much going on today beyond, networks that I'm part of, beyond conversations that I've been following since like 2008, and I'm really happy about that, and I'm really happy to continue to be a student of what continues to grow as a mobility justice movement. So I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, Adonia, for that very beautiful origin story. I want to remind our attendees, if you have questions while any of us are talking, please put them in the Q&A. We do have time toward the end of the keynote to address some of them. Adonia, before we shift to Angie, I do have a couple of questions for you. The first question is easy, I think. And it is, can you explain for folks who are here what you believe the difference is between mobility advocacy and mobility justice? What's the difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. The term mobility can be applied to so many things. And in some ways, I think when we started using the concept of mobility justice in 2016, we liked mobility because of that broad application. It's not talking about one mode of transportation. It's not talking about just commuters. It's not talking about just able-bodied people. There's such a spectrum of mobility in terms of what we have access to in the bodies that we're in. And at the same time, what I've learned since then is a lot of times mobility as a concept gets very owned by the transportation industry. And it gets very owned by people who are still thinking in a more kind of capitalist growth framework. They might not be talking about using oil and gas. They might be saying, oh, we're moving away from that. But in some ways, they're continuing that same kind of model of having ownership held by one small group of people, of having a gap between, the racialized experiences of a lot of people out there in cities and what's happening in a company or an agency. So I think the difference between mobility advocacy and mobility justice is what we're talking about with mobility justice is linking in with the legacy and the growth of other kinds of justice movements. And in particular today, I would say climate justice is a movement that my thinking has been very influenced by. So what we're talking about in terms of a shift to mobility justice, it means not just fitting in the kind of mobility that we like into today's existing political and economic system. It actually means shifting how we do work in those spaces so that more kinds of people's experiences can be accommodated, more kinds of opportunities can be created. So really thinking about that systemic change is more what we're talking about with mobility justice.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. One more question for you before we move on. A lot of your origin story, the images that you showed, the stories that you told us, seem to be rooted in this notion of collectivity and gathering. And I'm just curious, what role do you think joy plays in mobility justice work and in the mobility justice movement? And then also, how can we honor joy and collectivity as virtues during this time where we're responsible for being socially distant?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think for me, where I've seen joy is absolutely in the coming together. I mean, I kind of, I'm very aware now as an adult that the experiences I had as a kid were, I didn't really feel like I was part of something beyond my family. I always felt like I was part of my family, but I was different from the other kids at school in a lot of ways. At the same time, I didn't want to, I didn't see myself as like better than my Mexican immigrant classmates, but there was something different. Like I would go to my grandma's house on the weekend and, you know, she was an old white lady and I was part of this white family through my mom. And yet at the same time, then when I went to high school and, you know, all the kids in my advanced classes were white or other ethnicities. There were just 2 Chicana girls besides me in, you know, all these advanced classes. I knew that I didn't necessarily fit on that side of the line either. I just felt like someone who was in between. Like I'm just, it's like story of my life. So for me, you know, finding a sense of community around being in multiracial spaces and being in these projects where we recognize, oh, dang, there's a way we see the world. And not everybody recognizes that. But also, we have something good to contribute. Like that can be really validating. That can be really galvanizing. So yeah, so getting to be in space with people who come together around what makes us unique and different has been a big source of joy for me over the years. And when I was working in Washington D.C., I didn't find that community there, but I was able to reconnect with it when I came back to Los Angeles. So, you know, that's why I really feel like I've been home since 2015. And in terms of right now, you know, finding joy, I think like that's a challenge, right? Especially given that we're just going through such a time of trauma that people don't have time to process. We're not giving people the space to actually go through the loss and the fear and the sense of insecurity about what's happening to our loved ones. And, you know, so you know, I think it is a real challenge right now, but I certainly have a lot of hope. And you know, what I anticipate will be future joy when we get to be in space with each other again around just the incredible bravery that so many activists are bringing to their work this year, and showing the connections across these different movements and these different issues, and this like, you know, absolute like, okay, so let's start holding Biden accountable. Let's get to work. The work has only just begun. Like, I think that narrative, even though it's about work, there's joy in it too.
Thank you. And without further ado, we'll have Angie Schmidt join us and share her origin story.
Hi, thanks so much. It's such an honor to be speaking with you 2 women. I'm gonna take a little bit different approach than Dr. Lugo, and I'll get started with sharing my screen. Let's see. So Dr. Thomas told us to choose a multimedia thing to illustrate our story, and for mine, I just chose, this is just a YouTube video of swallows. So I'm gonna talk about how in my career, and I've had sort of a change of frame, and how in planning, we always need to be open to things that we're missing. We always need to be revising our sort of priors and listening, because there's things that we can easily overlook. So the reason I chose this video is to talk a little bit about my background. I'm not gonna go quite as far back as Adonia did, but I came to this from being a newspaper reporter in my home state of Ohio. So I used to report on suburbs, I used to report on planning processes, and I also reported on cities. And in Ohio, our cities are we've had a lot of decline. There's really a lot of inequality and a lot of hardship, especially between the suburbs and the cities. So that's sort of what motivated me to get interested in planning. I thought, you know, this is a real injustice, and I wanted to be involved in the solution. But for a long time, so recently I published a book, and the book is about I call it the pedestrian safety crisis in the United States. And usually when I do a presentation, it's just a deck of slides that's sort of about that, trying to explain that phenomenon. And it turns out it's a problem that's very closely related to some of these problems we've been talking about in planning, sort of how neighborhoods of color, people with disabilities have been overlooked, their neighborhoods have been disinvested, and they haven't received the infrastructure they need, or whatever it may be, street lighting, that kind of thing. So anyway, the reason I chose this video of swallows is it's about sort of a change in perspective I had and what led me down the path of writing this book and choosing that topic, which is something people always ask me when I'm going around giving presentations now. How did you get interested in this? So for about 9 years prior to writing the book, I started the book about 2 years ago. I have been working as a reporter at Streets Blog, and Streets Blog was we're very focused on reporting about sort of the effort to improve biking, walking, and transit conditions in the United States. So I came from sort of a mainstream background. Came to this problem from sort of a mainstream background. Sorry, excuse me. But anyway, sorry, I'm having a little, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. So about 5 years ago, I had my first child. My son was born. I now have 2 kids. So when people ask me that question, how did you get into this? One of the ways was that having a child changed my perspective. It changed the way I move around. So prior to that, I've been, I think a lot of people come into this with an interest in bikes, and that's sort of how I was introduced to the field as well. I was a little bit of a bike commuter, and then all of a sudden I've got a newborn baby, and I can't, you actually cannot put a newborn baby on a bike. I didn't even realize until I was like far along in my pregnancy. Children have to be about 9 months or a year before they can get on a bike. So I started doing most of my journeys by walking. And I think as I was reporting on these issues, transit and biking really were considered the more sexy items. And even though there was this big increase in pedestrian deaths that was occurring. So I started thinking that it was sort of overlooked and that it could use some more attention. So anyway, back to the reason I shared that video about birds. My whole life, as I mentioned, I used to be a reporter, and I always thought birds and bird watching was this very dorky old person habit. So I just never paid attention to that at all. And then when my son, he's 5 now, he's my oldest, all of a sudden out of the blue got really interested in birds. And we have this book at home that's just sort of an adult catalog of all the birds in North America. And he started getting really interested in it. And all of a sudden, it sort of opened my eyes to this whole thing that was going on around me all the time that I had never noticed before. I was just ignoring it, the different species of birds that live where I live in Ohio. And the video I showed was actually swallows, and you see those around. They look a little bit, I'm gonna share it again. They look a little bit like bugs, and they sort of swoop down. They feed on bugs. So anyway, I think like in Cleveland, where I live and in Ohio, it's not a place that's in the same way LA is, that sort of not bowls you over with beauty. You sort of have to look for it. And the reason I wanted to share this and how this changed my framing is I think new people can come into our lives, especially if we're close with them, and open up our minds to things we had never noticed before. And I think that's a little bit how the work Dr. Adonia and Dr. Thomas are doing in planning is, because we have had these blind spots about people coming from different cultures, sort of in the mainstream. And we are all we all do operate from a framework that's based on our identity. So there hasn't been in planning sort of enough attention to some of these issues. And in my book, I came at it looking for what is causing this problem where pedestrians are dying in increasing numbers. In the past decade, there's been a lot of attention to these kind of issues. There's been a lot of attention to biking. There's been a lot of attention to making cities more walkable. Why has the problem gotten worse? And I think it goes to the fact that planning has overlooked some of these core issues. There's a real disparity in the United States about what our neighborhoods look like. And that goes right down to the condition of the sidewalks, to what kind of facilities are available at bus stops, to even issues like street lighting. If you look at neighborhoods around the United States, neighborhoods of color are less likely to have those kind of basic safety infrastructure features. And they haven't been centered in planning discussions the way they need to for us to really get to the heart of that safety problem that's killing so many people. About 6,400 people are being killed every year while walking in the United States. And overwhelmingly or disproportionately, they're people of color, but also people from other marginalized identity. And that includes older people, people who have disabilities, and different groups like homeless people. Also, there's a lot of evidence that shows that they are at increased risk. So to tie it all back in, I think that the conversation that Adonia has been trying to raise, that Dr. Thomas has been trying to raise, a shift in framing, in planning, and more attention to the issues faced by people of color and a broader, like Adonia said, a broader lens is really important just for some of these core issues. And we will not succeed at our goals, whether it's sustainability, whether it's climate emissions, or whether it's safety, without addressing some of these core problems in our cities, coming back to racism and inequality. Okay, so that sort of wraps up my presentation.
Thank you very much, Angie. And again, I'll remind attendees, if you have questions, I saw a couple come through the chat. If you have questions that you'd like any of us to respond to, please make sure you put it in the Q&A box. Angie, I have two questions for you before we invite Adonia back to the space to have more of a collective discussion. My first question is, you know, these conversations about mobility advocacy typically center bicycling, right, as the mode that we're choosing for people to shift to. And we'll talk in a minute about the ban cars rhetoric as well. But we usually choose bicycling as the mode that we want to move folks to. Your work centers what it's like to be a pedestrian, right? The experience of the pedestrian a lot of the time. So can you talk about the distinctions in terms of spatial characteristics, health outcomes? I consider traffic fatalities to be a public health crisis. So you talk about the difference when we think about health outcomes, and talk about the demographic spread between pedestrianism and bicycling.
Yeah, so I come to this in a lot different way than Adonia, where I was just trying to explain a phenomenon, and it turns out it's really related to these wider racial injustices we have. But I think even the reason that pedestrian safety had been overlooked compared to bicycling is because sort of the status of cyclists compared to pedestrians. And I do think it's very clear that pedestrians in the United States, for the most part, are lower status than the people who are driving. There's some exceptions, in certain cities where now we have a lot of gentrification, and we do have some high income neighborhoods that are more walking oriented. But so in the United States, about 10 times as many pedestrians are killed every year as cyclists. So, and I also think bicyclists, again, because of status, were able to sort of dominate discussions about street safety to the exclusion of what does this look like for someone who's relying on the bus in Florida and having to stand next to like a 7-lane arterial. What is that like? And one of the problems I think it created was this, whenever there was that sort of problem came up, it was always the solution is a bike lane, right? Like if we can add bike lanes, that's sort of the solutions for pedestrians. But I don't think that really results it. I think it's very different in every city, what's needed. But in a lot of cases, I'll be researching a pedestrian death. Like I looked at this really horrifying quadruple fatality in Arizona, and you look at where it happened, and right next to the street, there is a bike lane. Now, it's not a very good bike lane, but a lot of the more dangerous streets in Florida and Arizona do have bike infrastructure already. So we need to be thinking more broadly about that. And even things like the way some of it is less visible and less sexy and less designy. And I think that's one of the reasons it gets overlooked. Like the kind of things people will share on Twitter would be this, very colorful new design that looks good from an aerial view. And it's not so much about, okay, if an older person walks up to a walk signal, do they have enough time to get across? That's the kind of thing that's totally invisible, but ends up being really important. And actually, I think if you look at the data, is a real injustice that's happening to folks.
Thank you. Both really great origin stories. So Angie, I'm gonna ask you one more question before we move on. I really appreciated your connection to the swallows. I also have a connection to swallows as someone who, I got my first job in planning as an environmental planner and was completely annoyed with my state's obsession with protecting swallows. And so I appreciate what you offered up, because it's not that I've never noticed them. It's just that I've always struggled with the way our environmental protection regulations and planning processes tend to honor the lives, and it's easier for them to see animals and nature and plants, right? All valid and important observations, right, in our work. But there was always a disconnect between being willing to shift the entire project timeline and, you know, add another $500,000 to the budget to preserve and protect swallow habitats under the freeway overpass, right? Mm-hmm. The freeway that dug thousands of feet into indigenous burial grounds, right? And it's continuing to widen and disrupt very sacred land. So I appreciated your video because it helped me shave off a little bit of my animosity about swallows in the state of California. But to that end, and to your point about the importance of stopping to recognize those and that which we have willfully chosen not to see in our work and in the built environment. I'd like to hear about what aspects of your own identity you would want centered in mobility planning. And if you could describe what the environment would look like and feel like if someone had taken the time to design with you in mind, that would be great.
Yeah, so I consider myself, feminism is really a big part of my lens. And I do think like the experience of becoming a mom and caring for young children just is not, just is throughout, and it's not just in transportation, but sort of throughout our economy, it's just not given the consideration it deserves. When we talk about low-income folks, you know, when I'm immersed in these political discussions, I feel like there's always, and we do the same thing in planning, where it's like we imagine who the person is we care about. And in planning, the person we think of, the like normal person we plan for, is like a middle-aged man, probably, maybe a woman, but that kind of guy that commutes in a car from like a suburb on a highway, maybe, to downtown. That's who we've been planning for. And I think really the world, the way people operate and the way our communities are much more diverse. People have much more diverse needs. So my own identity, I'm pretty privileged, but I do have this experience of being a mom, and it's changed the way I've traveled tremendously. And the main thing it's done is reduce the sort of distance I can travel. I stay much closer to home, and I did go through the process of having 2 children and not having a car, not having a primary vehicle as my own, and the stress sort of trying to navigate, you know, dangerous drivers, making it across a dangerous intersection, the stress of that when you're actually shepherding, you know, helpless kids who have their own ideas and don't understand sort of the risks, is just, it's very difficult. And again, I'm a really privileged person who can avoid some of the situations, don't always have to hop on a bus out in a, you know, suburb at night with 2 children. Not everyone's that lucky. So I do think if we were planning for a more diverse set of people and scenarios, it would go a long way. And I think that should include, like, how can we better serve not just mothers, but anyone who has caregiving responsibilities, especially now that we have this issue with Corona and as the population is aging. It's always been about the commuting trips, and it's always been about long trips over short trips. And that's one way women are sort of disadvantaged in planning, because women do more trips or more short distance trips, and they do more trip chaining. Their travel patterns are a lot more complex. But also I think they're the ones really that a lot of mothers are not only are low income, but they're responsible for other people. So if you help a mom, you're helping 2, 3, 4 people, not just one person. So that's one way I think that my identity has helped shape the way I think through this.
Yeah, and I think that that's a perfect segue into the collective discussion that I would like to have with both you and Adonia. And I'm just thinking about sort of two literary things come to mind for me. Thinking about how my perspective and lived experience feels very much situated like in between the two of yours, almost sandwiched in there. And I'm, thinking about what it means to be taking on the role of caregiving and really the role of mothering, which, Adonia, my fellow anthropologist, probably knows that culturally the role of mothering in other regions of the world is not always ascribed to people who fit into the construct of being a woman, right? And so I've often struggled with phrases like how women move. Sorry for anyone whose work that is. But I've always struggled with those phrases because I feel like it's not just your gendered identity as it's been constructed, but it's about the reproductive labor and assignments that society has placed on you, and how the built environment meets you or erases you, right? And so you are self-described feminist. I describe myself as a womanist, which is a term that Alice Walker has given us. But I'm thinking about this notion of, this bridge called my back, and how for a lot of Black women, and especially trans Black women, our various movements for social justice, including mobility justice work, are literally situated on the backs of Black women who have been making it very plain and very clear that our built environments are hostile. The way we enforce and surveil them are incredibly harmful. And so womanist, teachings and framing is really about this idea that because of our role as Black women in society, who are responsible in terms of reproductive labor for everyone, right? For white women, for brown women, for Black men, for all of the children of the world, for making sure the political landscape doesn't go down the drain, right? All of this labor is on our backs, and we lean into this duty to honor everyone. And so one of the distinctions between womanism and feminism is this idea that we openly acknowledge that we want to bring Black men, cisgender Black men, along with us on our journey to disrupting and transforming what we know this place to be. And I also think about another womanist virtue, which Adonia spoke a lot about, which is this notion of interconnectedness and collectivity. And also, Angie, you spoke about, taking on this new identity as a mother, realizing that your travel was closer to home. And I'm just thinking about how our field, the academy that creates planners, engineers, architects, and the like, our planning firms, the agencies that govern and implement planning concepts really have not taken the time to really hold uphold the spirit of intra-community connectivity, right? We don't have very many neighborhood network planning efforts underway. In fact, I would argue that we don't have very many practitioners who would even know the first thing about how to plan a neighborhood network, right? Because so much of our work has been about moving the body to the labor, or moving the person with the money to the product that the person is going to buy, moving the child in his segregated community to the school, right? It's always been about how do we move people quickly, right, from one end of the city to the other. And even in our planning documents, where we're asking people for funding to fund our projects in 2020, our argument, the basis of our argument is we think it's a good idea and most beneficial if we give this Black community, this brown community, this indigenous community, this poor community, right, transportation options that move them outside of their community, because there's something about their community that is not desirable enough or worthy enough for concentrated investments that don't benefit anyone that's not in the community, right? And so I want us to infuse these themes that I'm bringing up now in the rest of the conversation that we're going to have, and I do see some questions coming into the Q&A. But in the spirit of our duty to all, one of the things that I don't want to get lost as we bring up racial inequity and racial justice movements, and we bring up the impact that COVID-19 has had on our knowledge and connection to the built environment, is where do unhoused people fit into our calls for transformation within the field of transportation and mobility planning? Where do they fit? Not just how many of unhoused people are likely to die and that type of narrative, but how do we remove the contention between folks needing to seek shelter outside because we haven't given them dignified housing options, and folks wanting full, unadulterated access to the sidewalks and the streetscape, despite people needing to seek shelter in those same spaces?
Well, one example that that I've witnessed recently that I just think is really powerful because it brings together the crisis of how many unhoused families are out there and transportation systems in California is this group called the Reclaimers that had when the pandemic hit, stay-at-home order was issued in California in March. They'd already been organizing for a long time around this spot over in a neighborhood called El Sereno in East LA, where Caltrans had seized, that's the state Department of Transportation, had seized a whole bunch of houses, I think decades ago, for a freeway expansion that that isn't going to happen. That it got canceled, but they just had these houses sitting there empty. So a local community center had been strategizing for years about, what do we do about that? There's houses right there. People need houses. So so this group, the Reclaimers, they moved in, and it was a lot of single moms who had been houseless and other folks, and now they've actually gotten to a place where Caltrans is at the table working with these community groups to establish, I think, a community land trust so that the housing will remain affordable. And legalizing, what was an informal effort. So I feel like that's a really hopeful example in terms of, the power that transportation agencies have around not just public space, but even eminent domain, and what could we do with that power if the focus was on people need a safe place to stay. Not just move, but also stay, because these things are intertwined. Like here in Los Angeles, there's so much visibility of the affordable housing crisis on our metro system and on our streets and sidewalks, like you're saying, Dr. Thomas. And, for our transportation agencies to see their business as being more around supporting industry efforts is really a shame. And I do think that that's, kind of where we are. The transportation sector, sees itself as an industry. It's a money-making enterprise. And even though we have all these public agencies that are supposed to be guaranteeing certain kinds of access, we have not shifted out of that paradigm. And I see that paradigm very much getting reproduced even in sustainable transportation kinds of conversations. So if we can get to a place where our transportation, agencies have an understanding, not just around big, complicated, transit-oriented development projects, how they fit in with housing, but also at this just like living, moving level, it would be wonderful to see what could come out of that.
Just real quickly, I would add, so looking at this problem of pedestrian deaths, there's some evidence that, like I met with some people in Nashville recently, and they said 30% of their pedestrian deaths are homeless folks. So it is a problem that you can't really separate it from housing. And I think that we do, have those silos. And also we do have a very geographic approach. Like usually the way we approach this problem is, well, let's map where the deaths are occurring, and then we'll go out to the geography of where it's happening and try to fix that geography. And I think it would be interesting to instead take a framework where, okay, what are the communities that are most affected by this problem? Let's try to do a planning session with them and approach the problem that way instead of focused on a particular intersection. And you don't see people having a planning project that works with or is led by homeless folks, but they would be, obviously very knowledgeable about their movements and the obstacles that they're facing in different cities.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about this housing or land use conversation. A lot of people, even speakers in this that are participating in this conference, they're calling for car bans and also simultaneously advocating for promoting density, like more dense urban centers, and also considering density in suburban areas. Have either of you considered the potential for compounded inequalities for low-income people, racialized people, and people with disabilities? Should we take on these framings or these frameworks for new planning? And is there a middle of the road that justly holds and considers the nuanced and important experiences of people who might be harmed by an overhaul of the built environment at this time?
So I think your work has done a really good job elevating, how there can be some tension there, especially as we have cities around the country that are becoming so gentrified. I come from a city that has a little bit in Cleveland. Our growth patterns have been a lot different than LA. We still have a lot of disinvestment in the city and a lot of sort of growth, homogenous growth in the exurbs. So I think it varies a lot city to city, but we absolutely have to make sure we're not causing additional harms with this stuff that on its face is a good idea, making the transportation system more sustainable. So I do think, it's gonna take really considering putting the people who have been harmed sort of at the front of the planning process, and not always coming in thinking we sort of have the solution already in place.
Adonia, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about how do we grapple with the the image of cars, the use of cars in this landscape. So I really strongly identified as car free from 2008 to like 2013 maybe, and really had to like reckon with moving out of that identity in 2015 when I came back to Southern California to live, because you know, my motivation there in joining that community and taking on that identity was I saw cars as this harm, you know, extremely harmful thing. I stopped feeling safe being in cars. You know, I just like, as I developed my consciousness around the connections between climate change, traffic fatalities, and this overinvestment in auto-oriented transportation systems, I didn't like being in cars, and so I lived car-free in LA for a number of years and was able to do that. You know, it's pretty possible. And part of what I felt like I was reacting to was the stigma toward non-car travel in Southern California. We have this, you know, it's just, you can trace it back to the origins of when we first had a mass transit system based on streetcars before private automobiles were affordable here. LA was a very racist place in the early 20th century. I'm not saying it's not racist now, but it was a really racist place in the early 20th century. And, you know, what happened between about 1880 and 1920 was a huge explosion of population here. So many white people moved here from other parts of the US to live in new neighborhoods that had been built, many of them accessible through streetcars. And so there was this great big network of streetcars that went all over the region, not just in the city of LA, but connecting to, you know, even down to where my family lives in Orange County. Well, guess what you have to do on public transit? That's still an issue for some people today. You have to spend time with people you don't necessarily want to be associated with. And so when private automobiles started to be affordable, LA was like, hell yes, we're getting away from those streetcars, those big bad streetcar companies. Because remember, back then, public transit wasn't publicly owned, it was privately owned. People saw cars as this wonderful symbol of freedom and a racist way to be segregated, you know, and not have to be on streetcars with those, you know, brown people and those black people. There's so much to be unpacked there. So for me, you know, as a scholar and a woman of color activist, I saw the car-free identity as a way of pushing back against that and being like, hell no, I like being on public transit. Public transit is a good space to be in. Sure, people have problems, but that's because of the way that society has structured poverty and put it on the shoulders of urban communities. It's not because being on the bus or the train is somehow like a bad way to live. So, you know, for me, like riding public transit, riding a bike, walking were part of pushing back. But the thing I've had to come to accept over the years is cars also do a lot of good in our communities. And, you know, is it really my place to decide for somebody who faces struggle in so many areas in their life that, you know, in transportation, they need to take on the car-free struggle? I am, you know, again, when I came back to LA in 2015, was going through so much personal turmoil of my own in terms of my career and what did I want to be doing as an activist. I just had to accept, like, there's a way that people see, there are many ways that people see cars that are positive, and I want to fix our system so that people don't have to seek safety or economic opportunity or any of those kind of things in cars, but we're not there yet. So I'm pregnant with a little girl who's due in March. Really excited about that, but I'm also thinking, God damn it. The first thing I'm going to have to do once this kiddo comes out of me is strap her in a car seat and drive her home. Why? And I'm not going to feel so good about that. You know, I'm already like, oh, I at least I won't get on the freeway. We'll just drive really slowly, you know, and, you know, try to feel safe. And then I'll just keep her indoors for months and not take her out because of, you know, the sensitivity that I'm getting around traffic violence again. But I so wish that we could just, you know, make some changes, and all the young men who I hear revving their engines, or the motorcycle clubs that I see with all the like older gentlemen on their souped up rides. I so wish that there was some way we could give them a sense of power that wasn't through their motorized vehicles. But until we do and we reckon with that, I think we've got ourselves in a bind where to say you're going to take away somebody's car means you're going to take away their power. And, I don't think that's not a position personally I want to be in as a community-based activist, to be saying, yeah, it's on you to give up this thing that's been a vehicle to opportunity. It's on you to give up this thing that is such a powerful symbol. People can't afford homes. Well, maybe they can be doing, really exploitative gig work and get a car loan through Uber or something. They can at least have a car, So that's, blah. I wish it was something we could all be on the same side of, but I don't think we're there.
I think the problem is car dependence. It's not cars, right? Like, we're always going to need some cars. It's the car dependence that's really the problem. And we do have some cities now where transit commuters, anyway, are wealthier than people who are commuting on buses and trains. So we're having these big demographic shifts, and it does really shake up sort of people's stereotypes about who rides transit and who drives, especially as these housing prices go through the roof in a lot of our more transit accessible neighborhoods.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that the way we have come to think about transportation and mobility really, and I spoke about this at some point last week, we really conflate the means and the ends, and we forget that transportation, no matter how much you love it, is a means, right? And so that means we have to step outside of the compartmentalized notion of transportation as its own entity, right? As being disconnected or disjointed from every other aspect of being. And listen, people talk to me about giving up my car all the time. And I tell them, look, I would be happy to do that if you cancel my student debt and create a life for me that doesn't need me to be constantly chasing capital and finding opportunities to participate in the economy to pay down my debt to the United States government for getting the education that I was shamed into getting, right? And told and promised that it would be my way out of poverty. So yeah, erase my education debt, and I'm happy to travel close to home on foot and on bike every day. So before we have about 10 minutes left, before we take on some of the questions in the Q&A, I have one last question for you both. In community organizing, we have what I consider to be a proverb, which says, we never cross a picket line. What would you put forth as proverbial picket lines that your colleagues in the mobility advocacy or mobility justice spheres should not cross?
I can jump in with an example that ties in with a ballot measure at the state level here in California that unfortunately passed this month, where, okay, so we've got these ride sharing companies, Uber and Lyft, and they for years have refused to treat their employees as employees. They classify them as independent contractors. And this means that they are basically opting out of supporting the social safety net for the people that they have driving, their customers around. So it's a big problem. And it was one of the reasons behind the passage of a state assembly bill at the beginning of this year, AB 5, that said, all right, gig economy companies, you need to treat your employees like employees, because we should not be creating this other category of workers because, just inequities out the wazoo, right? So Uber and Lyft and some other delivery company got together and spent $206 million on creating and promoting a ballot measure called Proposition 22 that said we get to be exempt from that law that specifically was written to hold us accountable. And they confused the hell out of the public. They paid the state level NAACP. They paid Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They used images of Black and brown drivers saying, oh yeah, of course I want to be an independent contractor. And a lot of the public didn't understand what they were voting for. And so the proposition passed. So now Uber and Lyft, have that new pass. And so, my husband works in labor law. So that whole sector is, ready and working on how they're going to approach this next. But I think that rideshare companies that refuse to operate in a way that is accountable to the actual operators, the drivers, the people doing the work, holding profits for themselves, refusing to make sure that just basic employment protections are in place. I don't think we should be using those companies. So, I welcome, how folks are going to be developing locally owned rideshare systems that will keep that economy local, create employment, good employment, not feed into this idea that if you're a gig worker, you're a lesser worker. So yeah, I'm feeling lots of things about that right now. So that's just what comes to my mind. So we got to be supporting drivers in a really deeper way than those companies are willing to.
Yeah, thank you. Angie, did you want to add to that?
I'm afraid I don't have a really good answer, but I know that there's still highway projects across the country, including there's a huge one planned for Houston where they're still displacing people through eminent domain. So that's something I think sustainable planners should never be part of. And it's absurd that that's still happening. There's a woman named Lynn Ross, who I think you both know, who's a leader in the field, and she says two of our core values we bring to any project should be improving sustainability, but also preventing displacement.
Thank you. I'm going to use my executive privilege to pick one last question from the Q&A. Give me a second. Some of these are comments, so I don't feel so bad about skipping over these. Is there any way to reconcile infrastructure improvements with gentrification? Should the mobility justice movement become more involved with the fight to increase minimum wage and implement rent control?
Yes. We need more intersectional work happening to, like I was saying, I think it's going to take some time for transportation to shift from seeing itself as an industry to seeing itself as a not quite service provider, but like an active part of local economies. And part of that shift is going to be recognizing where there needs to be interconnection with other kinds of local economic activities, including, how are people accessing housing? How are people even making money to put food on the table? So I think part of getting more local or regional with our focus and not looking to these larger corporations to be the solution means we're going to be seeing where there's more possible interconnection.
Yeah, at the Thrive-Ins group, we're working on a model for cooperative or owned mobility hubs. And the reason we're doing that is because, again, for much of the Black community, generational wealth generation has been, inextricably tied together, and at least in our minds and in the country, socially, to home ownership. And as I see advocates in both the housing space as well as the transportation advocacy space begin to rally around this idea of dense housing models, I also see that what many generations of Black people in this country have set their sights on in terms of undoing the legacy of slavery and generating generational wealth are slipping away. And so one of the ways that housing field or housing advocates have successfully redistributed wealth to Black people in urban centers, especially, is through models like land trusts and cooperative housing structures. And so we are taking those frameworks and those concepts and applying them to mobility and to mobility hubs and mobility options, because we recognize that that is the way that big tech is generating its own new, economies and wealth structures, again, on our backs. And so we're trying to insert Black economy and Black stakeholdership into that space before it is completely co-opted, for lack of a better term. Angie, did you want to add anything? And then we'll wrap up by giving both of you an opportunity to say a few last words. I was going to read excerpts from your books, but my eyeglass prescription is not working anymore, and I didn't want to put you all through that struggle with me.
Yeah, just real quickly to this question of, transportation improvements potentially contributing to gentrification. I think like a lot of what we've been doing is kind of like big silver bullet projects. It may, something that's kind of flashy, and if people can kind of make their career off, look at this amazing new thing that I did. But what we really need more in cities is just people delivering the baseline things that we sort of expect and that are part of just normal government operations. Like a lot of our neighborhoods are missing streetlights where they need streetlights. They're missing curb ramps where they need curb ramps, and they're missing bus shelters. This is not flashy stuff, and it's just missing. So I think there should be more attention to sort of filling those gaps, and the more humble sort of improvements that do have a big impact on safety and quality of life, but aren't as splashy.
And do you have any closing remarks you'd like to share, Angie, before we wrap up? We've got 4 minutes left.
Well, it's a big honor to speak with the two of you, and I really appreciate the way you're leading this discussion. I think it's a whole new era in planning going forward, and it's got to be centering this issue. Racial justice, economic justice is sort of our big challenge in cities. And we can never forget that anything we do can have unintended consequences. And I think looking back at the last decade, we can see even with good intentions, there can be unintended consequences. So we have to always be on alert for that. We have to remain humble, and we always have to be listening to the community.
Yeah. How about you, Adonia?
I just want to uplift disability justice and the importance of that movement in creating a model for how to talk about mobility in a way that's really inclusive of a lot of different kinds of bodies, a lot of different kinds of abilities that people have. And, I started to witness when I was working in DC and was participating in a group called the Transportation Equity Caucus that disability is often part of transportation conversations, and then it even comes up in active transportation, but not in a way that actually centers the disability community's perspective. And I think we still have a lot we can learn in terms of centering that kind of work. And I was reminded of this last week because I got to hear a really great advocate who's the co-chair of the Transportation Equity Caucus, Dara Baldwin, speaking about, some of these issues. And I think that there's kind of I asked her a question, and her response made me think about how for so many of us, and I saw this so beautifully in the opening music and videos today, for so many of us, there's this sense of urgency around climate change and environment that has to do with how we're thinking about transportation and mobility. And what Dara reminded me of is for people who interact with a world that wasn't designed with them in mind, they're just trying to move. And so we haven't figured out how to just make sure everybody has access to mobility, let alone how mobility systems contribute to these big problems that we're facing. So what does it mean to, really bring in disability justice in a way that isn't about compliance and isn't about you know, an afterthought, but they created the mold. They are the ones who, you know, who can teach us how to work together among diverse communities. So I just want to uplift them.
Thank you, Adonia. And that brings us to the closing of this keynote panel. I want to congratulate the organizers of this conference for what I can already tell is about to be a beautiful experience, and one where we are centering much needed voices, perspectives, and identities in the work. Adonia and Angie, bless you, bless you, bless you, and congratulations on the success you've both had with your books. Please tell the attendees where they can find you, where they can purchase your books, and how they can hire you to come teach them how to do better jobs.
Okay, yeah, real quickly. So my book is called Right of Way: Race, Class, and the Silent Crisis of the Silent Epidemic of Pedestrian Deaths in America. And it's for sale at local bookstores by Island Press. If you use my last name, it's SCHMITT. You can get a discount on it. And I also have a little consultancy I'm trying to get off the ground. It's called 3MPH Planning and Consulting. And you can reach me there, Angie, at 3mphplanning.com. And thank you so much, Dr. Thomas.
And I am, let's see, okay, I'm putting in the link to where you can get Bicycle Race through my publisher, Microcosm Publishing. I use Instagram. That's like the only social media I'm like active on at this point. My handle is Urban Adonia. That's also the name of my personal website, urbanadonia.com, where you can get information about, you know, where I'm going to be speaking. And I'm the program chair of the Urban Sustainability Master's degree at Antioch University, Los Angeles. So I do a lot of educational work there, and then I'm happy to be part of, you know, classroom discussions and things like that. So feel free to reach out to me at alugo@antioch.edu.
Wonderful. And you can find me on Twitter mostly at Dr. Des, the planner, and also at thriventsgroup.com. I'll hand it back to the conference organizers, and I wish you all an amazing rest of the day and the rest of the week. Happy holidays.
All right. I think our esteemed panelists and our keynote speakers and pre-keynote speakers, and especially our organizing committee and sponsors for the summit this year, I do want to let folks know that they will be able to find the links for the afternoon sessions, the breakout sessions,